The sound of sirens pierces the humid air of Dar es Salaam. Young men and women in ripped jeans and bandanas scatter as tear gas fills the streets. Cell phone cameras flash. Freedom. Freedom! They shout, their voices echoing across the city. Tanzania, once seen as East Africa's island of calm, is now trembling. What started as a quiet political restriction has ignited into a storm of defiance. When President Samia Suluhu Hassan blocked opposition ally John Hetcha from traveling to Kenya to attend Raila Odinga's funeral, it wasn't just an act of control. For millions of Tanzanians, it was a breaking point, a moment that ripped open old wounds of repression and mistrust. This is not the Tanzania the world thought it knew. The same leader once praised for uniting a divided nation after John Magufuli's death is now accused of ruling through fear. The youth Gen Z are rising, chanting not for chaos, but for accountability. "We are too young to be afraid," one student shouted, but too old to keep quiet. And so, a question hangs in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Is Tanzania experiencing the birth of a new political awakening or the death of its fragile democracy? Across the border, Kenyans are watching, standing in solidarity with their Tanzanian brothers and sisters. For the first time in years, young Africans from two nations are united not by entertainment or social media trends, but by shared anger and a shared dream. If you believe that Africa's youth deserve more than fear, more than silence, more than empty promises, stay with us. Share this video so others can see what is really happening in Tanzania, because when a generation demands its voice, the world must listen. It began quietly, the kind of story that might have gone unnoticed, if not for the timing, the tension, and the person at the center of it all. Tundu Lissu, once celebrated as the moral voice of Tanzania's opposition, was arrested in April 2025 under accusations of treason. The charge, critics say, was not about national security, but about silencing dissent. His detention sent a chill through the political bloodstream of the nation. For many, it felt like the final proof that the rule of law in Tanzania had been replaced by the rule of fear. In the months that followed, anger brewed beneath the surface. Students whispered in dormitories. Journalists spoke in code. Religious leaders pleaded for calm. But the tension could not stay hidden forever. The spark came in the form of a man named John Hetcha, a loyal ally of Tundu Lissu, who was chosen to represent him at the funeral of Kenya's late opposition icon, Raila Odinga, a man whose own struggle for democracy had once inspired millions across Africa. When Hetcha arrived at the airport, he was stopped by security officers who handed him an order: "You are not permitted to leave the country." No explanation, no hearing, no due process. Within hours, the story exploded across Tanzanian social media. Hashtags like "Let Hetcha Go" and "We're Not Afraid" flooded TikTok, X, formerly Twitter, and Facebook. For many, this was not about one man's travel ban, it was about a government that no longer trusted its people. As anger spread, the government's silence spoke louder than any statement. Opposition members claimed that President Samia Suluhu Hassan had taken a page out of the Magufuli-era playbook, using security as a shield for suppression. The irony was painful. When she took office after President Magufuli's sudden death in 2021, Samia had been hailed as a reformer, Tanzania's first female president, a symbol of reconciliation and pragmatism. International observers called her the woman who would heal Tanzania. But 4 years later, those same observers were now asking a different question. Had the healer become the enforcer? Videos of police beating protesters in Dar es Salaam, Dodoma, and Arusha began circulating online. In one clip, a young woman held up a placard that read, "We buried Magufuli. Don't bury our democracy too." It became a rallying cry for thousands. The situation escalated when international lawyers and observers attempted to enter Tanzania to assess the legality of Hetcha's travel block, only to be detained at the airport and deported within hours. That single act transformed a national issue into a regional crisis. Local media were instructed to stay silent. Yet citizen journalists, armed with nothing but cell phones and courage, filled the void. In a matter of days, Tanzania was no longer the quiet success story of East Africa. It was the headline. "Tanzania turns against its youth," read one Kenyan paper. "Samia's democracy on trial," said another. Across the border, solidarity vigils were held for Hetcha. Even in Nairobi, Kenyan activists chanted, "Free your brother." Meanwhile, in the capital, President Samia remained composed, even serene. Her spokesperson dismissed the uproar as an orchestrated campaign by foreign-funded activists. But the more the government tried to frame the unrest as manipulation, the more people saw it as confirmation of their fears that power had become detached from the people. By late April, the protests had spread to nearly every major city. University students marched beside taxi drivers and market women. Churches opened their courtyards for those fleeing arrests. At night, bonfires lit the neighborhoods, a mix of defiance and despair. And amid the smoke and shouting, one truth emerged: the Tanzania of 2025 was not the Tanzania of promise. It had become a mirror, reflecting the same question haunting so many African nations when leaders call every voice of opposition a threat who protects the people's voice. The arrest of Tundu Lissu was the first tremor. The silencing of John Hetcha was the earthquake. And now the aftershocks were shaking the foundation of the entire East African region. The sun had barely risen when the first crowds began to gather near the Serari-Isabia border, the narrow crossing that links Kenya and Tanzania. At first, it was a handful of university students holding hand-painted signs that read "Free Hetcha" and "Justice has no border." By midday, thousands had joined them: boda riders, street vendors, and young activists waving both the Tanzanian and Kenyan flags. From the distance, the air was alive with noise drums, whistles, and the sharp echo of slogans that pulsed like a heartbeat through the crowd. "One Africa, one freedom," someone shouted. Within hours, videos of the border protest flooded the internet. Tanzanian and Kenyan youths were chanting together, their faces lit not just by the sun, but by defiance. This was the moment Tanzania's crisis turned from a domestic political scandal into a regional awakening. The spark of dissent had jumped the border, and for the first time in years, two generations across two nations were united by something greater than politics: the refusal to be silent. Inside Tanzania, demonstrations had spread from Dar es Salaam to Dodoma, Mwanza, and Arusha. Students filled university courtyards. Churches opened their gates as makeshift shelters. Every night, the glow of bonfires could be seen flickering in the alleys, symbols of resistance and fear intertwined. People whispered that police trucks were moving in, that arrests were imminent. Still, they stayed. "We are not here to fight," a young protester said in a live stream watched by millions. "We are here to remind our president that she serves the people, not the other way around." President Samia Suluhu Hassan remained silent for 3 days. Then, through her press secretary, she broke it, not with empathy, but with accusation. She claimed that foreign forces were fueling unrest, that digital agitators were spreading misinformation, and that the protests were an attempt to destabilize Tanzania's sovereignty. But those words had the opposite effect. The phrase "digital agitators" became a badge of honor. Young Tanzanians began calling themselves the digital resistance. They coordinated through encrypted apps, live-streamed police crackdowns, and published footage that contradicted official statements. Every attempt to silence them only amplified their voice. Meanwhile, international reactions began to pour in. The African Union's Youth Wing issued a statement calling for restraint and dialogue. Amnesty International condemned the government's actions, warning that the use of national security as a political weapon could destroy Tanzania's democratic fabric. Human Rights Watch demanded the immediate release of John Hetcha and other detained activists. Even global news outlets, BBC, Al Jazeera, CNN Africa, picked up the story. For days, Tanzania trended across social media platforms worldwide. Analysts began comparing Samia Suluhu Hassan's leadership to the authoritarian streaks of other African rulers who once promised reform but ended in repression. The domestic backlash grew fiercer. Senior members of the ruling party privately urged the president to de-escalate. Opposition groups, once divided, now stood united under one banner: Nenchachen Reform Now. Religious leaders called for national prayer. Universities suspended classes. Yet amid this chaos, what emerged was not hopelessness, but something new: solidarity. Across the border in Kisii and Migori, Kenya, youth organizations marched in support of Tanzanian protesters. Some carried placards that read, "Borders divide governments, not people." For many, the shared anger over corruption and political manipulation was transforming into a pan-African movement for generational accountability. Still, fears grew. Reports surfaced of disappearances of journalists detained, of activists interrogated at night. Parents begged their children to stay home, but the young refused to back down. "We grew up in silence," one university leader said, "and silence gave us nothing. So now we speak, even if they call it rebellion." And there, at the height of confrontation, Tanzania faced its most defining moment in decades. Would the government open dialogue or open fire? Would President Samia see in these young voices the echo of her nation's hope or the shadow of her own downfall? The standoff at Serari-Isabia was more than a border protest. It was a symbol. A sign that the new Africa, the digital, restless, and fearless Africa, was no longer waiting for permission to be heard. When the protests finally spread beyond the major cities, Tanzania crossed an invisible line. What began as an outcry for John Hetcha's freedom had transformed into a nationwide demand for political renewal. The shockwaves reached every layer of society, from market stalls to parliament halls. In Dar es Salaam, taxi drivers refused to work for a day in solidarity with students. In Dodoma, teachers wore black armbands to signal mourning for the death of justice. And in the smaller towns, Shinyanga, Mbeya, Morogoro, local councils canceled meetings out of fear that public gatherings could ignite more unrest. The political establishment felt the tremor. Several members of the ruling party Chama cha Mapinduzi (CCM) privately expressed unease. Some warned the president that continuing the hardline approach could fracture the party from within. One leaked message from a senior CCM member read, "Madam President, the people no longer fear us. They pity us, and that is far more dangerous." For the first time in years, the myth of control had cracked, but the price of defiance was high. Hundreds of protesters were detained. Independent journalists were summoned for questioning. Radio stations received quiet guidelines about what they could and could not report. Yet the stories kept coming smuggled through USB drives, hidden in encrypted messages uploaded to cloud drives by anonymous citizens. The government, in its effort to silence dissent, had unknowingly birthed a new form of journalism, grassroots, digital, and fearless. Civil society began to reorganize itself under new banners. Faith leaders, lawyers, and youth organizations created what they called the People's Forum, demanding three core reforms: an independent electoral commission, restoration of media freedom, immediate release of political detainees. Each demand struck at the heart of Tanzania's political order, and each was ignored. As the stalemate deepened, a quiet rebellion emerged inside Tanzania's bureaucracy. Mid-level officials started leaking information, court orders, police memos, and evidence that contradicted government claims. These leaks revealed a coordinated attempt to fabricate charges against Tundu, Lissu, and John Hetcha, confirming what many had long suspected, that the state had weaponized the law itself. Meanwhile, the economy began to suffer. Tourism, one of Tanzania's main sources of revenue, plummeted. Investors grew wary. The shilling weakened against the dollar. Supermarkets reported shortages of imported goods as cross-border trade slowed. Even state employees whispered that their salaries might soon be delayed. The streets grew quieter, but not calmer. The silence was heavy, not peace, but fatigue. Still, beneath that silence, something powerful was taking shape, a shift in political consciousness. For decades, Tanzanians had accepted politics as something decided for them. Now, the youth were redefining it as something decided by them. They no longer saw the ballot box as the only tool for change. They saw their voices, their hashtags, their footage, their marches as political weapons in their own right. In universities, professors began holding open lectures on constitutional reform. Musicians released songs with hidden messages about resistance. Even local elders, once wary of activism, began recalling the liberation struggles that built the nation. The political consequences were undeniable. Samia Suluhu Hassan's approval ratings dropped dramatically. Once seen as the stabilizing figure of East Africa, she was now portrayed by both domestic and international media as the president who lost her youth. By mid-2025, the nation stood at a crossroads. Parliament debated emergency laws. The army was quietly placed on standby. But outside, the people had already made their decision. They would no longer trade silence for security. And in that defiance, raw, chaotic, and uncoordinated Tanzania rediscovered something it had nearly lost: the belief that power belongs to the people, or it means nothing at all. As Tanzania's crisis deepened, the world could no longer look away. For the first time in years, Dar es Salaam, a city known for its quiet diplomacy, became the focus of global headlines and diplomatic cables. Governments, human rights organizations, and regional blocs were all forced to answer the same uncomfortable question: was Tanzania still a democracy, or had it quietly become another strongman state wrapped in polite language? In Washington, the U.S. State Department released a cautious statement: "We are monitoring the situation in Tanzania and urge all parties to respect constitutional rights, freedom of expression, and peaceful assembly." It was diplomatic restraint, the kind of phrasing that says everything and nothing at once. Behind closed doors, however, the tone was different. According to insiders quoted by Foreign Policy, the Biden administration viewed the crisis as a strategic headache. Tanzania had been a stable ally in East Africa, a partner in counterterrorism and trade. But the images of police clashing with unarmed youth were making that alliance politically costly to defend. American lawmakers began to take notice. A small group in Congress called for an aid review, arguing that continued funding for Tanzania's security apparatus may indirectly enable repression. The U.S. ambassador in Dar es Salaam requested urgent consultations, while the Pentagon quietly put a hold on a joint training exercise with Tanzanian forces. Across the Atlantic, the European Union expressed deep concern. France and Germany suspended several development programs pending clarity on human rights conditions. In the United Kingdom, members of parliament debated whether to sanction key officials connected to Tundu Lissu's arrest. But the loudest reaction came not from Western capitals, but from within Africa itself. In Nairobi, Kenyan youth groups organized candlelight vigils outside the Tanzanian embassy. The African Union Commission on Human and People's Rights issued a rare public statement urging President Samia Suluhu Hassan to restore confidence through dialogue. Even the East African Community, EAC, long hesitant to criticize its members, convened an emergency session to address growing instability in a partner state. Political analysts began comparing the movement in Tanzania to earlier uprisings from the Arab Spring to the youth protests in Nigeria and Senegal. But what set Tanzania apart was the digital coordination. Instead of mass rallies led by charismatic figures, this was a decentralized, leaderless movement powered by smartphones, encrypted chats, and a new kind of civic imagination. Meanwhile, China and Russia, Tanzania's newer strategic partners, took the opposite approach. Beijing dismissed the unrest as an internal matter, while Moscow reaffirmed its support for the legitimate government of Tanzania. Both nations quietly increased their outreach, offering security equipment and digital surveillance tools, reinforcing the perception that a new geopolitical chessboard was forming over Africa's democracies. For many in the West, the dilemma was moral as much as strategic. Intervening risked accusations of neocolonialism. Staying silent meant complicity. And so the U.S. and its allies hesitated, watching, waiting, calculating. Yet across social media, Africans were no longer asking for saviors. They were demanding solidarity. One viral post read, "We don't need the West to rescue us. We need them to stop arming our oppressors." By June 2025, Tanzania had become a mirror for the world, reflecting the uncomfortable truth that democracy is fragile not just in Africa, but everywhere. And as the protests raged, one headline from The Guardian captured the global sentiment perfectly: Tanzania's youth are not waiting for permission to be free. When night falls over Dar es Salaam, the city glows with two kinds of light, the cold blue of phone screens and the warm orange of street bonfires. Both tell the same story: Tanzania has reached a breaking point. What began as outrage over one blocked passport has exposed a deeper truth: a nation where dissent is now treated as treason, and where loyalty to the state is valued more than loyalty to justice. Yet in that same truth lies a rare and dangerous hope. Because every generation reaches a moment when silence becomes more unbearable than fear. For Tanzania's youth, that moment has come. Across Africa, young people are watching. From Lagos to Nairobi, from Accra to Ouagadougou, they see in Tanzania a reflection of their own struggles, the fight to speak, to dream, to be heard. They know that freedom is not a gift handed down by leaders, but a responsibility claimed by the people. Even in Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traore once warned, "When the voice of the people is ignored, power becomes deaf." His words echo louder today as Tanzanian youth refuse to bow even under the weight of tear gas and fear. Their uprising is not just against one leader, it is against the idea that leadership means ownership. But here lies the warning: every movement that rises in light can also be swallowed by darkness. Without unity, without clarity, without discipline, revolutions can devour their own dreams. That is the danger Tanzania faces now, and the lesson Africa must heed. Because the world will not save Tanzania. Not the United States, not the European Union, not even the African Union. True change, as history has always shown, must be homegrown, nurtured by courage, guided by wisdom, and defended by solidarity. So we must ask ourselves, will President Samia listen before the fire consumes her nation? Will the youth channel their anger into reform, or let frustration turn into chaos? And what lesson will the rest of Africa learn from Tanzania's pain? These are not just Tanzanian questions, they are continental ones. Because when one nation's democracy falters, the silence that follows spreads like smoke. If you believe the truth matters more than the narrative, if you believe Africa's youth deserve the right to shape their own future, then stand with them. Share this story. Speak about it. Because silence is the language of oppression, and today Tanzania is teaching the world to unlearn it. Please share if you believe that Africa's youth deserve to be heard. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines.